without giving too much away of what you say in your book, can you give us an idea of how blogging differs from the several countries that you went to and that you speak about?
As you said at the beginning, I went last year to Cuba, Egypt, Iran, Syria, Saudi Arabia and China. And every country except for Cuba, the web is very developed. There's an online community, sometimes small, sometimes bigger. In Cuba there is online media in a small way. Every country except for Cuba made a decision about 5-10 years ago that the web was a great way to make the country economically stronger. Not many countries at the time were fearful that the web could be used for dissent. They of course realised in time that that was the case, and now many of those countries that I went to censor the web or filter the internet or filter certain keywords or whatever. And Western multinationals in places like China, I think like Google and Yahoo and Microsoft, are helping the regime censor the web. In Cuba, the Castro regime took a different policy for two reasons. One, there's the embargo, the US embargo, which is sort of an insane criminal embargo which has achieved nothing apart from entrenching the regime. And it's allowed the Castro regime an excuse to not have an open and unfettered web, or for that matter freedom of speech as well, because the argument being that we have a lot of US spies who are trying to undo our regime, which is not untrue, but the Castro regime, and this is something that I've often had debates with the people on the left who I think have been too uncritical about how the Castro regime has operated, that with all the achievements of the revolution 50 years ago, the simple fact is that there's no freedom of speech, freedom of press and freedom of religion. So Cuba was an exception. There are bloggers there now who are speaking out, based in Havana, and they have a bigger audience overseas than they do in Cuba, but they are there and they're speaking out. And the government doesn't like it because often they're very critical of what Fidel and now Raul Castro is doing. In other countries, one of the things I was trying to do, every other country I went to, my aim was not just to speak to bloggers who are well known necessarily, but speaking to writers and dissidents and as average citizens, or often women. In many of these countries are very disempowered just by the nature of the society. In a place like Iran, for example, or Egypt, women are not equal, there's no doubt about that. There's massive issues with gender politics. And in Egypt, for example, there's been 95% of women given female circumcision at birth or close to birth. Now, for a lot of women in Egypt and elsewhere around the world, that's a highly problematic issue. And what you have in the last 5 years in Egypt is a number of female bloggers who have quite a name for themselves now, who are campaigning against this tradition. It is a tradition. It's a very bad tradition, but it is a tradition, and many women, often older women in places like Egypt, support it, and men, but women too. So it was really inspiring to see these women who often, mostly Muslim women, who within their own families are struggling to actually debate this sort of thing because their mothers or even sisters may support, for example, female circumcision. But they are, through their blogging and often risking a great deal by speaking out about this, trying to raise awareness of why it's not a natural thing, why it should stop, and why, as a society, it should be condemned. And ironically enough, in Egypt it's actually illegal. Technically it's not allowed, but like so many of these cultures, cultural relativity or cultural reality is very different to the practical, to what the law says. So one of the things that really interested me, I guess, also as a man, was speaking to many women about how they use the web to empower themselves and deal with gender issues. I said in Iran, it was fascinating to see how the number of people, and particularly women and men as well, but women too, firstly are often second-class citizens in their own country anyway, so that's already a disadvantage from day one. And in the last 3 years, since Ahmadinejad, the president, has come in, there's been a real crackdown on women, student rights, unionists, activists, journalists. There's always been a lot of censorship in Iran, but it's got a lot worse in the last 3 years. So you have a thriving web community in Iran. There are 70% of the population is under 30 in Iran, so it's a very young population. Many people are incredibly tapped into the web. Most are not writing about politics, that's true, but many of them are talking about, say, sex or drugs. The one I found it amazing there's this thing in what the Iranian regime have done, is something called temporary marriage, which is really interesting. It's basically, you're not supposed to have sex before marriage, like in every religion, technically, like Christianity, Judaism, Islam. But the Iranian regime decided years ago, they accepted the fact that a lot of young people want to have sex before marriage. So to sort of legitimise it in a religious sense, they started up this program called temporary marriage. So essentially, if you're gay, that's going to be a problem anyway, but let's just say that you're straight for a minute. If you find a partner, so to speak, and you want to sleep with them, you basically go to a cleric who gives you a temporary marriage, which could be anywhere between 5 minutes to an hour to a month to a year to 99 years. This sounds crazy, this is what happens. And there's very well-known websites about temporary marriage which exist, which have actually very explicit discussion about sex. So in other words, as much as this is sort of, on one level, quite unhealthy, and I met some guys who've been married 40 times, so, and women too, generally speaking a lot less. Now, there are issues about gender politics there too. Generally speaking, there is still a culture, like in many countries, where men can have sex a lot before marriage and women aren't supposed to. There are those kind of issues that go on, which is problematic. But the temporary marriage thing, I met many people there, some particularly guys who realised it was absurd. But the web, on one level, has allowed these new traditions to be discussed. And I was amazed talking to people. I can't read fast enough to the language in Iran, but it was fascinating talking to people and them showing me the websites about temporary marriage, which were started by highly religious people who believe in the sanctity of no sex before marriage, so they say, and yet these websites have explicit discussions about sex written by men and women about what they may have done last night. So that, in a way, A, is not talked about much in the West, and B, it's something that the web has allowed, which wasn't so possible when it was happening before the web existed. But now people can go online and kind of read basically sort of pornographic websites which are kind of condoned, should I say, which they get condoned by the regime. So it's fascinating. All that stuff's in the book as well.